no matter what you do, guns, no guns, it doesn't matter. You have people that are mentally ill.
Bring mental illness out of the shadows.
What is the relationship between mental illness and violence?
The shooters in Tucson, Arizona and Aurora, Colorado are believed to have significant mental problems.
That tragedy could have been prevented had our mental health system been in better shape.
Stigma still is a very big issue.
Many people believe those suffering from mental illness are likely to be violent and dangerous. But how much of that is stereotype and how much is reflected in the actual research? We'll explore that and other questions related to mental illness in today's episode of Science Forecast.
Thanks, Jim. Today I'm going to be interviewing Dr. Pescosolido here in the Ken and Audrey Buckley studio in Franklin Hall. We'll discuss her studies on mental health stigma, which she conducted in 1996 and 2006. Let's see where she is now. Dr. Pescosolido has been teaching at IU since 1981 and earned the title of Distinguished Professor in 2006. She has been the co-director of Indiana University Network Science Institute since 2013 and is also on the Committee on the Science of Changing Behavioral Social Norms. Before I sit down with her, let's hear from Jim about the different grants she's received over the course of her career.
Dr. Pescosolido has received more than 90 grants from a variety of sources. For example, in 1995, Dr. Pescosolido was awarded $150,000 from the MacArthur Foundation. From 1998 to 2014, she was granted over $11 million from the National Institutes of Health. These grants funded several studies examining the relationship between communities and the outcomes of mental illness, particularly suicide and mass shootings. Spanning over the decades, with grants as varied as her research, Dr. Pescosolido has received just over $17 million. This is a map of science where continents are not North America, Asia, and Europe. Instead, they're science disciplines. You can see the overlap between these areas. A push and pull is created when new links are generated between them. In each episode, we'll explore a researcher's work in one of these areas. Dr. Pescosolido's studies are concentrated in this region, but as you'll see, they cross over several disciplines.
Dr. Pescosolido, thanks for joining us today. We're going to focus on your study of stigma and mental illness. Why did you decide to do this study?
Well, I actually stumbled into it. I was interested in pathways to mental health care, and I was thinking about how the models that exist seem to be very individualistically oriented, very static, very focused on how people weigh the costs and benefits in their head. And two things occurred to me. The first is I didn't know anybody who made their decisions that way. And the second thing was that certainly the issue of mental illness interferes with cognitive functioning. So why would we use that kind of model to understand how people are trying to interpret different kinds of behaviors or thoughts or feelings that they have? And so once I had established that model, I started thinking, what's in these networks, right? What is it that people tell each other? And I, as a classically trained sociologist, my first thought went to Irving Goffman and his classic study of stigma that took place in St. Elizabeth's Hospital in the 1960s. And I got into the literature and I started thinking about it, and I found that we hadn't had a national study since 1950.
Can you explain a little bit about how the study was carried out?
There have been a number of changes, some for good and some for bad. The most important change I think that we've seen is that Americans have become more sophisticated about mental health. They name many more types of disorders that represent good mental health and mental health problems. They also are more open. I think this was our most significant finding in terms of change, was that Americans have become more open to talking about and disclosing their mental health problems. On the bad side, however, one of the questions just asked them spontaneously to say what mental illness is. And one of the things that we saw was a dramatic increase in the number of Americans who spontaneously mentioned violence as part of mental illness.
You mentioned that Americans, our categories of mental illness are far more broad than they were in the past.
Yes.
Compared to the previous study. Can you tell us a little bit about drug and alcohol addiction, which you included in your study, and why stigma continues to persist against those two things?
Americans are much more negative toward people with substance use disorders than they are to people with mental health problems. And that was a surprise given the severity and the standard stigma associated with schizophrenia. The other was that for the first time, we saw things moving in the wrong direction. Right? So that it was only with regard to alcohol issues that we saw that moral attributions went in the wrong direction. In other words, with regard to depression, schizophrenia, we saw that people have bought into, or they understand the role of genetics, they understand the role of chemical imbalance, or what we call the neurobiological explanations. And we've almost reached a ceiling in the United States in terms of people saying they understand that. But look what happens with regard to alcohol. We see a dramatic and statistically significant jump in the percentage of Americans who mention that alcoholism is really due to bad character. So while the disease, like any other tagline, is working for mental illness, it is not working for substance abuse disorders in the U.S.
Why do you think in general that people are increasingly associating violence with mental illness?
Well, I hate to say it to you, but I think the media has a big role in this because the research is quite clear. The research that was done by the MacArthur Law and Mental Health Network has shown that if you take the crimes committed by people with mental illness out of the American crime rate, you're left with 96% of the American crime rate. And we also know that people with mental illness are more likely to be victims of crime than perpetrators of crime. But you know, stereotypes continue to exist because there's always a little kernel of truth. And it is true that individuals who are in active episode, who are comorbid with alcohol or drugs, are more likely to be violent. But that's a very tiny group of people with mental illness.
Do you have any predictions for next year's study going forward?
Oh boy, that's a great question. Well, I think that we're concerned, we're hoping that the amount of effort that's being done in America for anti-stigma campaigns, and also I think the attitude, the very positive attitude of the millennial generation, I'm hoping that that will begin to show up in lower levels of stigma than we saw in the comparison between 1996 and 2006. So I'm hoping to be pleasantly surprised.
Can you tell us some of the things we can do to change stigma just in our daily lives?
Well, I think the thing is to recognize that everybody has something that they struggle with, and that people with mental health problems are not dangerous unless they're comorbid with alcohol abuse or with drugs, and to be more inclusive of people who are different. And I think that the way that we want to proceed here at IU, because we are doing the national pilot study for colleges and universities to create a college toolkit to make college campuses safe and stigma-free, that what we're trying to do is have everybody think about difference and how difference is something that should be celebrated rather than stigmatized. So no matter what it is that makes you feel different, if you can accept it in others, then maybe you can accept it more in yourself. So hopefully if people understand that there are natural ups and downs in people's lives, that for some of us that will mean that we'll dig a hole, or we'll get a hole dug for us that we need help getting out of. And that doesn't make you crazy. It makes you a person who's dealing with important stresses.
And those things can all help us change stigma going forward.
I hope so.
Absolutely. Thank you once
you.
again, Dr. Pescosolido, for joining us here today.
Okay, thank you.
As you can see, Dr. Pescosolido's 30 years of research integrates findings from across several fields, from the area of health professionals, brain research, medical specialties, and of course, social sciences. Thank you for joining us on this episode. We look forward to bringing you the next episode of Science Forecast.